Frank Miller had seen many things in his life as a biker, but nothing prepared him for the sight of a 60-year-old woman in a wheelchair being shoved to the ground by laughing boys in red jackets. The diner went silent, forks froze in midair, and every eye turned as the so-called tough kid sneered. That was the moment Frank's gravelly voice cut through the room like thunder. Respect is not optional. Not in my house. What happened next would shake the entire town. If you believe stories like this remind us of what really matters, take a second to share your thoughts in the comments. How would you have felt if you were sitting there that day? I wish you a good day filled with kindness and strength. The morning sun fell softly across the streets of Maplewood, a quiet Midwestern town where the hum of pickup trucks mixed with the aroma of coffee drifting from its few diners. Inside Maple Diner, the air was thick with the clatter of plates, the hiss of bacon on the griddle, and the murmur of locals who had eaten there for years. It was the kind of place where everyone thought they knew everyone, and routine was as comforting as the smell of buttered toast. Into this steady rhythm came Clara Johnson, 60 years old, her hair streaked with gray, her dark skin lined with years of struggle, seated in a wheelchair that bore the scratches of long use. She had dressed neatly in a faded blue cardigan, a plain cotton dress, and sensible black shoes, her scarf tied carefully as if each detail was a small act of dignity. She wanted nothing more than to enjoy a simple meal in peace. As she maneuvered her way through the doorway, the bell above the frame gave its familiar jingle, but the sound was quickly followed by the shifting of eyes. Some patrons looked away almost instantly, stirring their coffee or bending lower over their newspapers. Others let their gaze linger with that uncomfortable mix of pity and disdain that Clara had felt all her life. She had grown used to it, but that never made it easy. She wheeled herself slowly toward a corner booth near the window, trying to tuck herself into a quiet spot where she would not disturb the rhythm of the room. Her hands tightened on the rims of her chair, the metallic squeak echoing louder than she intended, as though announcing her presence in a place that wished she would remain invisible. From the booth across the aisle, 3 young men sat slouched against the red vinyl seats. They were all in their late teens, each of them wearing bright red jackets embroidered with a high school football emblem. Their hair was neatly cut, their sneakers spotless, the kind of boys who never worried about paying for meals because their parents' names carried weight in the town. Their leader, a tall boy with a sharp jawline and restless eyes named Travis, leaned back with a smirk that already suggested mischief. On either side sat Mason, wiry and quick with nervous laughter, and Kyle, heavier built, his voice always booming a little too loud. Together, they carried the cocky energy of boys who had never been told no. It started with a whisper from Travis, pitched just loud enough to carry. Look what rolled in. Another welfare case looking for sympathy, Mason chuckled, his hand covering his mouth as if that might disguise the cruelty of the words. Kyle leaned forward, shaking his head in mock disbelief. That rusty chair is going to scratch the floor. This place is supposed to be clean. Their voices weren't loud, but they were deliberate, intended to reach Clara's ears, to cut into the fragile quiet she was trying to preserve. Around them, the diner went about its business, the waitress scribbling down orders, the cook flipping pancakes, yet there was an almost tangible tension in the air. Clara heard every word. Her shoulders stiffened, but she kept her eyes on the menu lying flat before her, pretending to study the list of omelets and sandwiches as though her life depended on it. Inside, though, a storm brewed. She had endured such barbs for decades, the sting of being dismissed or reduced to her disability and her skin color, but somehow it still pierced as sharply as it had the first time. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she wondered if she should simply leave, retreat into the cold morning, and spare herself further pain. But then her pride, that quiet ember that had carried her through so many indignities, held her firmly in her seat. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her flee. Travis was not done. As if seeking an audience, he rose casually, walking toward the counter. Passing by Clara, he swung the door wide as though to hold it, then abruptly let it slip from his fingers. The heavy frame slammed against the side of her wheelchair, jolting it so hard that she nearly lost her balance. Clara gasped, clutching at the table for support, the menu sliding to the floor. "Careful there, ma'am," Travis sneered, his words dripping false courtesy. "Wouldn't want you to tip over." Mason and Kyle erupted in laughter from the booth, their shoulders shaking, their faces lit with cruel delight. A couple of customers shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. Sarah, the young waitress, stood frozen by the coffee machine. She was 23, with sandy blonde hair tied back hastily, her pale face freckled and now flushed with shame. She had always prided herself on being kind to the regulars, but this moment paralyzed her. The diner's manager had warned her once, "Don't provoke the rich kids. Their parents practically keep the place alive." So she gripped the coffee pot tighter, her knuckles white, and told herself to stay quiet. Yet the guilt burned inside her as she watched the older woman struggle for composure. Clara straightened her scarf and tried again to anchor herself, but the boys escalated. Kyle, broad-shouldered and restless, sauntered over under the pretense of heading toward the jukebox. As he passed, he placed one hand sharply on the back of Clara's wheelchair and gave it a hard shove. The chair jolted forward, wheels squealing across the linoleum, and Clara's body lurched before she toppled sideways. She hit the cold floor with a thud that echoed far louder than the laughter that immediately followed. Her palms scraped against the tiles, her purse sliding open, coins spilling and rolling across the diner like tiny echoes of her humiliation. The laughter of the boys rang harshly, filling every corner of the diner. Travis clapped his hands together, grinning at his friends as if he had just scored a point in some twisted game. Mason bent over the booth table, laughing so hard he nearly spilled his soda, while Kyle puffed out his chest, basking in the thrill of cruelty. Around them, silence spread like a suffocating blanket. Forks froze midair. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. The cook peeked through the pass window, then quickly ducked back, pretending to be busy. Nobody moved to help Clara. On the floor, Clara's heart pounded against her rib. Not just from the fall, but from the familiar weight of humiliation pressing down. She pushed herself up with trembling arms, her fingers slipping against the tiles. Her knees throbbed from the impact and her breath came in shallow gasps. Still, she forced herself to rise, her expression hardening into one of fierce pride. She would not cry in front of them. She would not give them that satisfaction. Slowly, painfully, she gripped the armrest of her wheelchair and pulled herself upright, sliding back into the seat with a determination that drew a thin line between dignity and despair. Sarah's throat ached with unshed words. She wanted to march across the room, to throw the boys out herself, but the fear of losing her job pinned her in place. Her hands shook as she poured a cup of coffee that no one had ordered, her eyes darting toward Clara with a silent apology she could not voice. Customers shifted in their seats, some looking down at their plates, others sneaking guilty glances toward the corner where Clara now sat with her head high, though her chest rose and fell with uneven breaths. For Clara, the diner that morning became both a battlefield and a cage. Every eye that refused to meet hers, every smirk that clung to the boys' faces, weighed heavy on her spirit. She clenched the rims of her chair so tightly her knuckles whitened, forcing herself not to tremble, not to let them see how deep they had wounded her. In that silence, she held on to the only thing they could not take from her, her pride. And though her heart was breaking, her eyes lifted, steady and unflinching, daring anyone in that room to deny her place at that table. The sound of Clara's wheelchair scraping against the linoleum and the cruel laughter of the boys still hung in the air when the heavy door to the kitchen swung open. The diner, already silent with unease, seemed to fall into a deeper hush as a massive figure stepped through the doorway. He was broad-shouldered, towering, his worn leather vest stretched across a chest built from decades of hard living. His face bore a jagged scar running from his temple down toward his jaw, his beard gray and tangled, his eyes sharp beneath heavy brows. To those who didn't know him, Frank Iron Hand Miller looked like a man carved out of asphalt and steel, someone you'd cross the street to avoid. Whispers rippled among the diners. A trucker in the corner muttered under his breath, "That's Iron Hand." Even the three boys, who just moments earlier had been cackling with arrogance, stiffened in their seats at the sight of him. Frank had once been the leader of a biker crew that was whispered about in every roadside bar from Ohio to Nebraska. He had walked away years ago, trading in roaring engines and bar fights for the hiss of a diner's grill. Still, his presence carried the weight of that past, and even now it made grown men shift uneasily on their stools. But Clara, who was trembling slightly as she steadied herself in her wheelchair, felt none of the menace that others saw. As Frank's heavy boots crossed the floor, his voice did not carry rage, but something softer, steadier, though wrapped in gravel. He crouched down beside her, one hand surprisingly gentle as he guided her upright and slid the fallen purse back into her lap. "Easy now," he said quietly, his breath smelling faintly of coffee and tobacco. "You're safe here." His massive frame shielded her from the eyes of the crowd, and for the first time since she had entered, she felt the weight of humiliation lift ever so slightly. Straightening to his full height, Frank turned toward the three boys, his eyes narrowed, his scarred face unreadable, his voice dropping into a tone that rumbled like distant thunder. "In my diner," he declared, letting the silence stretch across every table, "no one humiliates a woman. No one mocks the weak, not while I'm standing here." His words carried not just authority but finality, as if carved into stone. The room seemed to contract around him, forks set down, breaths held as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Travis, still trying to muster his earlier bravado, smirked and leaned back in the booth, though his fingers drummed nervously against the tabletop. "We were just joking, old man," he muttered, his voice louder than necessary. Mason and Kyle exchanged uneasy glances, the laughter that had once seemed endless now catching in their throats. Frank didn't flinch. His eyes held them steady, as though he had spent his entire life recognizing fear beneath false bravado. "If it was a joke," he said evenly, "then you won't mind cleaning up the mess you made." For a moment the boys thought he meant the coins still scattered across the floor from Clara's fall, but Frank's gaze swept across the entire diner. "Grab the mop. Wipe the floors, clean the dishes, do it now, and do it while these people are watching. Let them see the difference between strength and cruelty." The command landed heavy, and a ripple of shock moved through the diner. A man near the window stifled a laugh, and an older woman shook her head in approval, though neither dared speak. The boys hesitated, their pride colliding with the weight of Frank's authority. It was Kyle, the biggest of the three, who finally shifted first, his shoulders slumping as he muttered a curse under his breath and shuffled toward the mop bucket near the counter. Mason followed reluctantly, his cheeks flushed red, while Travis stayed seated a moment longer, his jaw clenched tight. But even he eventually rose, glaring at Frank with a hatred that came more from shame than defiance. The sight of them, in their spotless red jackets and brand-name sneakers, holding mops and rags, drew a few muffled chuckles from other customers. Sarah, still holding the coffee pot, felt her chest loosen as she watched. She had never seen anyone confront those boys before, never seen anyone treat them as anything other than untouchable because of their families. Frank had done it without raising a hand, without a single shout, just the calm certainty of someone who refused to bow. For the first time all morning, Sarah dared to smile, though faintly, and she felt a flicker of respect she had never allowed herself before. The boys moved sluggishly, dragging the mop across the linoleum, sloshing water carelessly, their faces burning with humiliation as customers looked on. A trucker at the counter smirked openly, and one teenager near the jukebox lifted his phone discreetly, snapping a photo of the once proud sons of the town's wealthiest families, reduced to janitors in a crowded diner. The image, caught in that instant, would later find its way onto screens beyond those walls. But for now, it was simply one more layer of shame. Travis's jaw tightened as he caught sight of the camera, his face pale with anger. Frank stood watch, his arms crossed, his gaze unyielding. He said nothing more, but his presence filled the diner like a shield, making clear that there would be no more laughter at Clara's expense. He knew what it meant to wear a mask of toughness, to mistake cruelty for power, because he had once walked that same path. But now, he chose a different strength, the strength to defend, to protect, to remind others of the respect they owed one another. When the boys finally dropped the mop and rags, their faces slick with sweat despite the cool air, Frank gave a small nod. "You can leave now," he said simply. They didn't argue. Mason hurried out first, Kyle close behind, and Travis lingered only long enough to cast one last furious glare at Frank before shoving open the door. The bell jingled as it closed behind them, leaving the diner quieter than it had been all morning. Some customers smiled, others returned to their meals, but the air carried a new weight, the memory of what had just unfolded. Clara adjusted herself in her seat, her hands still trembling, but her chin lifted. She glanced at Frank, who gave her a slight nod of reassurance before turning back toward the kitchen. To anyone else, he still looked like a grizzled biker with a scarred face and rough edges, but to Clara, in that moment, he looked like a guardian. The din of forks and conversation slowly returned, yet everyone in Maple Diner knew they had witnessed something that would not soon be forgotten. That night, Maplewood's quiet streets glowed under the dim light of street lamps, but the silence was broken by the invisible hum of social media. Within hours, the photo of three red-jacketed boys pushing mops across the tiled floor of Maple Diner began circling around town, passed from phone to phone, whispered about in living rooms, laughed over in bars. Some captions mocked their arrogance, others praised Frank Miller's firm hand, but all carried the same sting. The sons of privilege had been humbled, and everyone had seen it. For Travis, Mason, and Kyle, humiliation had spread far beyond the walls of the diner, and in their world, reputation mattered more than truth. At the houses of Maplewood's wealthiest families, anger boiled hotter than the comments online. Travis's father, Richard Callahan, a man in his late 40s with slicked-back hair, polished cufflinks, and a permanent air of authority, paced his expansive living room as his son stammered through a half-truth, insisting that Frank had humiliated them deliberately. Mason's mother, Evelyn Price, impeccably dressed in pearl earrings and a tailored dress, listened with narrowed eyes, already planning which contacts to call. Kyle's father, a stout man named Charles Wainwright who owned construction contracts across the county, slammed his fist against the table and declared that no ex-biker would ever shame his family's name. To them, their sons were not guilty boys caught mocking a disabled woman, but victims of an overbearing relic of a rougher age. By midnight, phone calls stretched across the county. Lawyers were summoned, favors were exchanged, and the story was rewritten to suit their cause. Words like abuse, public shaming, and endangerment crept into the conversation, reshaping reality into a version where their boys had been forced into labor against their will. Richard Callahan's connections in local media ensured that by morning, headlines hinted at scandal. Former biker humiliates teenagers in public stunt. It didn't matter what had truly happened. In Maplewood, the power of wealth often weighed heavier than truth. The next day, as the sun rose over Maple Diner, Frank stood behind the counter, his large hands wrapped around a coffee mug, his scarred face unreadable. The regular morning crowd was thinner than usual, the bell above the door jingling far less often. Those who did enter offered quick nods but avoided eye contact, slipping into booths with a hesitancy that Frank had not seen before. Sarah polished the counter nervously, her eyes darting toward Frank, who carried himself as if he felt the shift in the air, but refused to acknowledge it. Even Clara, seated in her corner booth, sensed the chill in the room, the way conversations hushed whenever Frank's name was mentioned. The hush shattered when a group of sharply dressed figures entered the diner mid-morning. At their head was a lawyer named Daniel Pierce, mid-50s, with salt and pepper hair, a navy suit tailored to perfection, and a briefcase clutched in one manicured hand. His voice carried a rehearsed sharpness as he announced their purpose. Behind him trailed Richard Callahan, Evelyn Price, and Charles Wainwright, their expressions tight with indignation. They did not bother to sit. They stood in the center of the room, ensuring that everyone present would hear. "Mr. Miller," Pierce began, adjusting his glasses with theatrical precision, "you are hereby notified that your actions yesterday constitute public humiliation and emotional abuse of 3 minors. Forcing young men to clean floors in front of strangers is not discipline. It is degradation. My clients are prepared to pursue legal action for damages unless you issue an immediate apology and compensation." The words hung heavy, calculated to both intimidate and shame. Sarah froze mid-polish, her eyes widening, and even the cook in the back peeked through the pass window to hear. Frank didn't flinch. He set his mug down gently, the sound of ceramic on wood louder than the lawyer's speech. "They mocked a woman in a wheelchair," he said evenly, his voice low but steady. "They shoved her to the floor. I didn't touch them. I didn't lay a hand. I simply made them clean up the mess they made." His words carried a plain truth, but in the face of polished suits and influential families, truth seemed like a fragile weapon. The parents scoffed audibly, dismissing his explanation as if it were a child's excuse. The lawyer smiled thinly. "That may be your version of events, but public perception matters, Mr. Miller, and public perception is not on your side. This town will not tolerate vigilantism, especially from a man with your history." He let the word linger history, as though Frank's past as a biker was evidence enough of guilt. Richard Callahan stepped forward, his voice dripping with authority. "You will regret humiliating my son. We will see you in court, and by the time we are finished, this diner of yours will be nothing but an empty shell." The threats echoed long after they left, the bell over the door jingling behind them with a finality that made the walls of the diner feel colder. The few customers who had stayed quickly finished their meals and slipped out, leaving Frank, Sarah, and Clara in uneasy silence. The weight of wealth and influence loomed larger than any physical fight Frank had ever faced in his past. He had stared down men with knives, gangs on motorcycles, and nights darker than any diner could imagine. But this battle was different. This was a war of paper, money, and perception. And in that arena, he was outmatched. Clara's heart ached as she watched the man who had defended her stand, surrounded by empty booths and whispered accusations. She had seen how gently he had lifted her, how fiercely he had spoken on her behalf, and now he was to be punished for it. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her phone, her decision already forming. She could not let him face this storm alone. That evening, sitting by her kitchen window as the last light faded, Clara dialed a number she knew by heart but rarely used. When the line connected, she heard the familiar voice of her son, David Johnson. He was in his 30s, tall, with the calm authority of a seasoned attorney who had fought his way from humble beginnings to the polished halls of Chicago law firms. "Mom," he said warmly, "is everything all right?" Clara's voice wavered, but her resolve did not. She told him what had happened, about the laughter, the cruelty, the fall, and the man who had stood for her when no one else would. And she told him of the storm now descending on him. David listened in silence, the faint sound of city traffic behind him. When she finished, he exhaled slowly. "So they think they can crush him with money and power." His tone hardened. "Then they'll have to go through me." Clara felt a surge of relief, her son's words carrying the strength she had longed to hear. In that moment, she knew Frank was no longer alone. The courthouse of Maplewood stood like a relic from another age, its brick walls weathered but its white columns still proud, watching over a town where money often dictated truth. On the morning of the hearing, the air inside the courtroom was thick with anticipation, the murmur of conversations echoing beneath the high ceilings and polished wooden beams. Townsfolk had gathered, some out of curiosity, others out of loyalty or disdain, and the benches filled quickly with faces both familiar and wary. Frank Miller sat at the defense table, his large hands folded in front of him, his scarred face steady but his eyes shadowed by years of battles fought in different arenas. Clara sat behind him, her wheelchair positioned near the aisle, her expression calm but her heart pounding. At the opposite table sat the families of Travis, Mason, and Kyle, flanked by a team of attorneys in sharp suits. Richard Callahan, Evelyn Price, and Charles Wainwright wore the expressions of people accustomed to control, their expensive watches glinting under the lights, their presence a show of wealth and influence. Their chosen lawyer, Daniel Pierce, stood with deliberate poise, his hair slicked back, his voice smooth with rehearsed certainty. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, addressing the judge in the court, "what we have here is a dangerous misuse of authority by a man with a violent past. My clients, 3 young men of this community, were forced into public humiliation at the hands of Frank Miller, a man once known as Iron Hand, a man whose reputation alone should raise concern." His words rang with theatrical venom, designed to pierce perception before facts could be heard. Frank sat silently, his jaw tight but his expression restrained. Every accusation hurled by Pierce chipped away at the silence, painting him as a villain in the minds of those listening. "These boys," Pierce continued, "were treated like criminals for what amounted to harmless teasing. They were compelled to clean floors like common laborers, laughed at by strangers, photographed without their consent, and shamed across this community. This is not justice. This is cruelty. And it is our duty to ensure that such abuse does not go unpunished." The parents nodded emphatically, their pride and anger mingling into a mask of righteous indignation. The judge, a stern woman named Margaret Doyle in her early 60s, listened intently from the bench. She had seen her share of theatrics, her gray eyes unwavering as she tapped her gavel lightly to restore order when murmurs grew too loud. Clara's hands gripped the arms of her wheelchair, her knuckles pale as she willed herself to remain composed. She knew the truth. She had lived it, yet she felt powerless watching Frank accused of cruelty when he had shown her only kindness. Sarah sat further back, twisting a napkin in her hands, her freckled face pale, guilt weighing heavy on her conscience. As Pierce's words reached their crescendo, as he demanded restitution and public apology, the tension in the room sharpened. Frank remained still, his silence almost stoic, but his eyes flicked once toward Clara, as if to reassure her without words. Then, just as the lawyer's voice echoed off the paneled walls with finality, the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. A figure entered, tall and composed, carrying himself with the practiced calm of someone accustomed to standing where stakes were highest. It was David Johnson, Clara's son, his tailored gray suit crisp, his tie neatly knotted, his dark eyes focused with unwavering clarity. He walked forward without haste, his polished shoes striking the floor with authority, and when he reached the defense table, he introduced himself to the court with a clear, resonant voice. "Your Honor," he said, bowing his head respectfully, "my name is David Johnson. I represent Mr. Frank Miller in this matter, and I also stand here as the son of Clara Johnson, the woman directly harmed in this incident." The shift in the room was immediate. Whispers flared, glances darted, and even Judge Doyle leaned forward, intrigued. The parents stiffened, their surprise briefly cracking the armor of their certainty. David opened his briefcase with measured precision, producing a USB drive. "Your Honor, with your permission, I would like to present evidence from Maple Diner's security cameras. It will demonstrate beyond doubt what occurred on the morning in question." The judge nodded, and soon the screen flickered to life. The grainy footage captured Clara entering the diner, the boys' mocking gestures, the shove that sent her to the floor, coins scattering, and their laughter rising in cruel chorus. The silence in the courtroom deepened as the truth unfolded in stark images. And then came the sound, muffled but unmistakable, of their taunts. Words drenched in the venom of prejudice, slicing sharper than any physical blow. Gasps rippled across the benches. Sarah pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes wet. Unable to remain silent, she rose, trembling from her seat. "It's true," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I was there. I saw them push her. I heard the words. I was too afraid to speak then, but I won't stay silent now." Others followed, an older man at the counter that day, a teenager near the jukebox, each admitting their silence, confessing their fear, but affirming that Frank had not touched the boys. He had only asked them to clean what they had dirtied. The tide of testimony shifted the air, turning accusation into revelation. David stepped forward once more, his voice steady and commanding. "Mr. Miller did not humiliate anyone. He did not strike them, did not curse them. What he did was hold a mirror to their actions. He taught boys who hide behind money that responsibility does not vanish with privilege. He reminded them, and all of us, that respect is not granted by wealth, but owed by character." His words echoed with conviction, not just crafted as a lawyer's argument, but spoken as a man defending both truth and honor. The room hung on his every syllable, the rhythm of his voice filling the silence left by shame. Judge Doyle leaned back, her gaze sweeping across the parents who now sat rigid, their expressions faltering. For the first time, the pride that had driven them here seemed to crack under the weight of evidence and testimony. Richard Callahan's eyes darted downward. Evelyn Price adjusted her necklace with trembling fingers, and Charles Wainwright exhaled sharply, unable to meet the eyes of the townspeople. The silence that followed David's final words was thick, heavy, undeniable. Clara's eyes glistened as she watched her son, pride swelling in her chest, her heart relieved that truth had found its voice. The judge's gavel tapped once, restoring order. "We have heard enough for today," she said, her voice even, but carrying a note of gravity. "The evidence presented speaks clearly, and this court will not ignore what it has seen." The weight of her words pressed down on the room, and for the parents, it was the first time they seemed smaller, less certain, their heads bowed beneath the collective judgment of truth laid bare. The air was still, reverent, as the chapter of accusation gave way to a moment of reckoning. The courtroom was hushed when Judge Margaret Doyle lifted her gavel for the final time. Sunlight slanted through the tall windows, painting lines of gold across the polished wood, and the air held the weight of resolution, all eyes fixed on the bench as her calm, unwavering voice filled the chamber. This court finds Mr. Frank Miller not guilty of the charges brought against him. For a moment, the room seemed to exhale together, the tension that had stretched tight for days breaking into ripples of relief and disbelief. Clara's hand trembled on the armrest of her wheelchair, but her face glowed with quiet pride. Frank sat still, his scarred features unreadable, though in his eyes burned a muted light of vindication. The judge's ruling did not end there. Turning her gaze toward the three boys seated with their parents, she spoke with deliberate clarity. Travis Callahan, Mason Price, and Kyle Wainwright, you will each publicly apologize to Mrs. Clara Johnson and Mr. Frank Miller for your actions. Furthermore, you will complete 3 months of community service at the Maplewood Nursing Home. Let this serve as a lesson that privilege does not excuse cruelty, and silence cannot erase responsibility. Gasps rippled from the gallery, a mixture of approval and astonishment. The boys shifted uncomfortably, their once defiant shoulders drooping under the weight of the judgment. Their parents, once so confident, now sat with faces pale and drawn. The judge delivered a final blow that echoed louder than any gavel strike. In addition, the families of these young men will provide financial restitution for damages to Mr. Miller's business and for the harm inflicted on his reputation. No man should suffer loss for choosing to defend another. Richard Callahan's jaw clenched. Evelyn Price dabbed at her forehead with a silk handkerchief, and Charles Wainwright stared at the floor. The courtroom murmured with the unmistakable sound of a town witnessing a balance it had long thought impossible wealth, bent under the weight of justice. Outside the courthouse, the air buzzed with reporters and townspeople. Microphones were raised, cameras clicked, and questions flew. But Frank, towering and rough-edged, simply guided Clara's wheelchair down the steps with a steady hand, ignoring the noise. David walked beside them, his tailored suit immaculate, though his expression carried the calm satisfaction of a man who had defended truth and won. Sarah lingered near the door, her apron long since traded for plain clothes, her eyes bright with something new, resolve. She knew she would no longer be the girl who stood frozen in fear while cruelty played out before her. In the days that followed, Maple Diner began to change. At first, a few loyal regulars returned, nodding at Frank with newfound respect. Then more came. Curious neighbors, families who had once avoided the place, strangers passing through who had heard the story. The bell over the door jingled more often, and the booths filled with chatter. Sarah worked with renewed purpose, her steps brisk, her smile genuine, and whenever she spotted a flicker of unkindness, she addressed it without hesitation. "Not here," she would say firmly, echoing Frank's spirit. "Not in this place." And no one dared to argue. Meanwhile, the three boys were seen sweeping hallways and serving meals at the nursing home. At first they scowled, dragging their feet through every task, but under the watchful eyes of the elderly they served, something began to shift. Pride gave way to embarrassment. Embarrassment softened into reflection, and though they never admitted it aloud, each came to understand that their punishment had not been cruelty, but an education in humility. Their apologies, delivered in halting voices at the diner one evening, were heard not only by Clara and Frank, but by the entire town. The words were awkward, but the sincerity in their downcast eyes spoke louder than their rehearsed sentences. For Clara, life at Maple Diner settled into a comforting rhythm. She returned often, sitting at her corner booth where sunlight spilled across the table, her scarf neatly folded, her hands resting calmly in her lap. One afternoon, as the diner bustled around her, she leaned toward David, who had lingered a few days longer before returning to Chicago. Her voice was soft, yet it carried the weight of truth. "Justice doesn't only live in courtrooms, son. It begins the moment someone decides to stand up." David met her gaze, his eyes warm, and for the first time in years, he felt the strength of his mother's pride as something almost tangible. Frank remained the same to the casual observer, broad-shouldered, scarred, his beard rough, his leather vest worn with age. To strangers, he still looked like the intimidating biker he once had been, but to those who knew him now, he was something else entirely. In his silence, there was compassion. In his presence, there was safety. And in his eyes, there was the steady light of a man who had chosen to lay down fists and lift up dignity. The people of Maplewood began to call him the silent keeper of justice, a title he neither sought nor acknowledged, but one that followed him nonetheless. Sarah grew into her role as more than just a waitress. She became a voice in the diner, a small but vital reminder that silence enables cruelty. Her loyalty to Frank deepened, not out of obligation, but out of gratitude. She saw in him the courage she had lacked, and she resolved never again to stand idle when others needed her voice. The townspeople saw her transformation too, and in time, they began to reflect on their own silence that day, their own complicity in allowing 3 boys to mock and harm without resistance. Maple Diner itself became a symbol, not just of good meals and hot coffee, but of something larger. It was a place where decency mattered, where respect was expected, where the scars of the past did not dictate the future. Families brought their children there, pointing toward Frank with quiet words about courage. Travelers stopped by, curious about the place they had read about online, where a man once called Iron Hand had shown his strength and restraint. The hum of the diner grew, alive with conversation, filled with the kind of energy that only comes when a community learns something about itself. On one quiet afternoon, as the last customers drifted out and Sarah wiped down the counter, Clara looked across the table at Frank. He was pouring himself a cup of coffee, his massive hands dwarfing the delicate mug, his expression as unreadable as ever. Yet in the soft lines at the corners of his eyes, she saw it clearly. Kindness, resilience, humanity. "You've changed this town," she murmured. Frank looked up, his brow furrowing slightly, then gave a small shrug. "Just did what anyone should have," he said, but Clara smiled because she knew better. Not everyone would have, and that was what made all the difference. In the end, this story reminds us that true strength is not found in wealth, status, or appearances, but in the quiet courage of those who rise above prejudice, in the compassion of those who defend the vulnerable, and in the silent sacrifices of those who choose kindness when it costs them the most. These are the people who change communities, not with power or noise, but with dignity and humanity. I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments, tell us what this story made you feel, and join our community by subscribing for more stories that honor compassion and justice. May God bless you and your loved ones with peace, strength, and kindness in your everyday life.